There is an unseen hand to me that leads through ways I cannot see.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
And some sweet day I'll take my stand, still holding to the unseen hand.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 015, The Unseen Hand of the New World Order. Our featured guest in the Midnight Hour is Ralph Epperson, author of 1985's The Unseen Hand, an introduction to the conspiratorial view of history, and from 1990, The New World Order. But first, a little cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page, as you know, is at Midnight Rider News Show. That's Midnight Writer News Show. Our Twitter is MWN_ST Patrick. MWN_ST Patrick. Our email is midnightridernews@gmail.com. And you all know that our shows and articles can be downloaded and read, respectively, at midnightridernews.com. That's midnightridernews.com. Our first guest tonight is Richard Otto. Richard is the author of The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republic. Richard Otto is an award-winning attorney at law and lives with his family in the state of Maine. He was kind enough to join us tonight, and I want to thank him so much for being on. Richard, how are you doing this evening?
I am doing pretty good.
You know, you've created an interesting title. What exactly is the paradox of our national security?
Well, the justification for our national security complex and its growth since World War II is basically that it was going to defend democracies around the world and spread democracy, expand our liberties, and enhance our security. And essentially, since World War II, what has happened, it may not have been what the original intent of the Truman administration, but what is the national security complex has done is it's undermined our security, it's diminished our liberty, and it has done very little to spread democracy around the world. How has it done that? One, in terms of democracies, whenever there was a social democrat that would rise to power in a country, whether it was Iran or Guatemala or Chile, these people inevitably, because they were replacing what was before them either colonial countries or countries that were controlled by colonial powers or countries that were very corrupt, run by authoritarian regimes, and which the companies pretty much came in, paid these people off and exploited their resources and their labor, and the country benefited very little from their activities within their borders. And what these social democrats would do is they'd take over, and they'd want to take the resources back from these companies and be able to generate enough money to rebuild their infrastructures, their public schools, their hospitals, their mass transit systems, and bring them into the 20th century. And by doing so, they essentially, basically, took away a great deal of the profits that these companies were making by exploiting their country. And these companies had alliances with our intelligence agencies, whether it was the CIA, whether it was MI6 in Britain. In fact, Allen Dulles had stock in a lot of these companies, United Fruit, Freeport, Sulphur, some of these oil companies. And essentially what they would do when these companies came to them and complained about what, let's say, Mohammed Mossadegh was doing in Iran, is that they would come in there and they end up overthrowing the government and replacing them with a brutal dictator. Not another democracy or someone that was somewhat friendly towards these companies, but an actual authoritarian regime that was brutal, oppressive, and over time, the people knew who put this person in power, and we ended up developing more enemies. And the other thing is in terms of liberty. The liberty, a lot of, Edward Snowden, of course, in his declassified information that he provided to the Guardian and the Washington Post, and some was leaked by WikiLeaks, essentially indicated what they're doing in terms of our liberty. We don't really have a right of privacy anymore. These intelligence agencies are collecting everything and anything they can get their hands on, and they don't have to prove that you did anything wrong. They just are doing it in the name of national security, cloaked by this huge wall of secrecy, and nobody knows they're doing it. In some cases, they're doing it without even the consent of the president. In most recent cases, like Operation PRISM, it was supported by the president. But a lot of times throughout history, these things were done without even the consent of the president or the Congress. They weren't aware they were doing these things. You also have, if you go historically, you have programs like Operation Mockingbird, which interfered with our freedom of the press. Essentially, the CIA created this program because they realized they could enhance their power and influence over domestic and foreign policy if they could get the media to do their bidding for them. And what they did was they created a symbiotic relationship. And this program was created by Allen Dulles, Richard Helms, and Frank Wisner of the CIA, and they were joined by Philip Graham of the Washington Post. And essentially they basically said to these reporters and to these news agencies, we'll continue to give you intelligence briefings and scoops if you will spread information out that what we want to be printed in your papers or disclosed on your radio stations or mentioned on your news shows. And what in the 1975 or so, the Church Committee found out about this program, and they realized there was about 400 journalists that were on their payroll. Almost every major media outlet was also part of the program, and Noam Chomsky said it was basically that those 400 journalists were the who's who in journalism, and they had them all in their back pocket, and they weren't necessarily fulfilling the public interest. They were spreading propaganda that not only encouraged people to support the policies they wanted, but also to create a profile of their own activities in a very positive light. And also our security, if you think about it. Let's take the drone program, for example. The drone program is basically violating the sovereignty of other countries, in many cases without their permission, and is killing alleged terrorist combatants, but inevitably they also kill what they call collateral damage. They're innocent bystanders that get killed. And when that happens, what do you think the people in that local area think about these drones? Not only are they fearful of them, but they begin to resent the United States, and at some point, especially if loved ones are killed, they begin to hate us. So we're actually creating more enemies than we can kill through this program, which is not enhancing our security, it's undermining our security. And these are just a few examples of how the national security complex is not promoting democracy, it's not enhancing our liberty, and it's not enhancing our security either.
Right, so at what point in our history did we really start sacrificing more liberty in an effort to gain more security?
Well, was never reported to the people after World War II that they wanted them to sacrifice liberty for security. This was something that sort of evolved covertly, and it evolved in not initially in a very insidious way. I think that there were some people like Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, and people like Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, who were very staunch anti-communists that supported the growth of this national security complex that began to develop a certain crackpot realism, as in the sense that it was all based on fear and paranoia of what the Soviet Union was capable of and what their ambitions were. And essentially, what contributed to this fear and paranoia initially was the fall of China during the Truman administration in 1949, and also the Soviets' successful detonation of an atomic bomb in that same year, which caught the national security complex and the Truman administration completely by surprise, because they thought we were at least 10, 12 years ahead of the Soviets in atomic weaponry. And all of a sudden, 3 or 4 years later, they have an atomic bomb. And then, of course, North Korea's invasion of South Korea. All these factors led and fed into this fear and paranoia. What happened after that, essentially, was that this anti-fervor, communistic fervor that was created in the country because of these concerns and these fears began to manifest themselves in very destructive ways. And we have the rise of Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism with his sidekick, Attorney Roy Cohn, in which they basically destroyed many prominent New Dealers and people in Hollywood and in the arts that were accused of being communists or spreading communist ideas or having been members of communist associations, or had friends that were communists. And they made these allegations in many cases without any proof. In fact, Alger Hiss, the State Department employee, his career was destroyed through fictitious allegations and evidence that was manufactured by Richard Nixon and the Dulles brothers.
Now, all those events lead us through the Eisenhower years, so I'm curious about Eisenhower's farewell address.
Yes.
What is it about Eisenhower's time in office that caused him to warn of a military-industrial complex? And I ask this because the former General Eisenhower ran an administration rife with CIA black operations, coups d'etats, and a very heavy-handed approach to international intrusion.
Well, like all presidents, he was very concerned about his legacy and how history would judge him. In the beginning, he was quite impressed with the CIA's successful overthrow of Mohammad Mosaddeg's government in 1953 and Jacobo Arbenz government in Guatemala in 1954 with hardly any loss of life or cost to the United States. And we were able to plausibly deny our involvement in those two operations. But by the end of his second term, the CIA started to have significant failure and similar operations that it was successful in the early part of the 50s, depending on your perspective, of course. In Laos, the Pathet Lao were on the offensive. That was the Communist Party in Laos. And they were defeating the CIA militia groups that were trying to keep the country from going communist. In addition, in 1959, Diem, the regime that we had implanted in South Vietnam, had barely survived the coup against it from within, because the people, he was not winning the hearts and minds of the people. He wasn't running a democracy. He was running a very oppressive regime, and he was alienating a lot of the people in his country. And he just barely survived the coup. In addition to that, the intelligence community were caught completely by surprise by the Cuban Revolution and the fall of Batista and the type of government that ended up occurring under Fidel Castro, which Eisenhower and Nixon and the Dulles brothers quickly labeled as a communist government. This was a great embarrassment to Eisenhower administration. He now had a communist government only 90 miles from our most southern territory of Florida, in the Caribbean that we considered a sphere of influence for the United States that we had controlled ever since President Monroe issued his doctrine in 1823. And here we had a communist regime right there in our midst. And not only that, and it was partly our fault, but nevertheless, when we refused to acknowledge or recognize Fidel Castro's government, he, for fear that the United States was going to try to reverse the revolution, went to the Soviet Union for support. And when he did that, at that point, the government decided that he had to go. And they not only were trying to overthrow his government, as you know, the CIA, with Eisenhower's support, formed an alliance with the mafia to try to kill Fidel Castro and his brother, as well as Che Guevara, the charismatic revolutionary leader that joined their government.
What I'm really asking, Richard, is why do you think he chose to use his farewell address to warn of a growing military-industrial complex that he had helped to create?
Well, because he finally realized he had created a monster that had undermined his own legacy. And what these other things that I talked about were led up to this major event. He essentially, in 1960, had an opportunity to negotiate a comprehensive test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. And there was actually a summit that was set up to occur in Paris that summer, in which he was going to meet Khrushchev, and their negotiating teams were going to iron out some sort of treaty that would be the first treaty between the two superpowers since the Cold War began. In addition, he was invited after that summit to go to Moscow and visit, which he would have been the first president since the inception of the Cold War to visit Moscow and the Soviet Union. So this was going to be a huge feather in his cap for his legacy, for history. And what happened is that prior to the summit, he discussed whether he should shut down the U-2 flights. These were high-flying reconnaissance jets that flew at about 70,000 feet that were taking pictures of the Soviet Union, trying to figure out where their ICBMs were located and where their military installations were to gather intelligence. And he asked Dulles, should I suspend these flights? And Dulles, based on circumstantial evidence, I believe indicated to President Eisenhower that these high-flying jets were invulnerable to Soviet weapons, and so that most likely they wouldn't be hit. And even if they were hit, they were manufactured in such a way that when they came down towards Earth, they would burn up before they hit the ground, and the pilot would die. Now, of course, the plane that Francis Gary Powers flew in May of 1960 essentially ended up being shot down. It was the first U-2 that the Soviets were able to bring down. And not only did they get the plane pretty much intact, they also were able to get the pilot. So they were able to parade in front of the international media, not only the pilot, but the plane as well, which embarrassed the Eisenhower administration significantly. Not only that, Khrushchev basically demanded that Eisenhower apologize for breaching Soviet airspace. Eisenhower refused to apologize. So what happened was the summit in Paris was cut short, and his visit to Moscow was canceled, and the negotiating teams went home, and no treaty was ever achieved. And Eisenhower was so pissed that he essentially had a meeting with Dulles after the fact and accused him of leaving a legacy of ashes for his successor. And I think that's what contributed to his warning, not just to the American people, about the insidious power of the military-industrial complex and its corporate sponsors, but a warning to his successor to watch out for these people.
And what a warning it was. It seems almost too historically perfect that Eisenhower ends up placing the ball on the proverbial tee for President Kennedy to knock out of the park after the Bay of Pigs. But it also leads me to this question. What role do you think the national security complex played in the death of President Kennedy?
It played a significant role. Now, I'm not saying that the national security complex as a whole killed President Kennedy. There were rogue elements within that national security complex that were involved in the planning and execution of the assassination, and were involved, and then many more people for a variety of reasons, whether it was to protect their agencies, to protect their own reputations, or to prevent a third world war in which McNamara estimated 40 million Americans would die within an hour. There was many people that were involved. Much more government agencies and officials were involved in the cover-up. But essentially, this is the rogue elements that were involved. And I don't think that James Jesus Angleton would have done anything without Allen Dulles' okay. And I don't think Allen Dulles would have done anything to put forward such a drastic action, such as killing a president, in order to stop his policies from becoming reality, if he did not have some support from what we call the deep state. And so what I think he did, and David Talbot talks about this in his book, The Devil's Chessboard, is he went around to certain major brokers, the power elite, if you will, in certain sectors of our society, whether it was Wall Street, the military, other intelligence agencies, and he basically didn't tell them what he was going to do, but he basically, in very vague terms, and this is speculation on my part, but this would be standard practice for the CIA. They never tell you exactly what they're going to do. They always do it in vague terms. And he said, if we took care of Kennedy, would you make a big stink about it? Would you demand an investigation? And when they didn't answer him, or they said they wouldn't interfere, then I think he went to his good friend who he had known since World War II, and James Jesus Angleton, who was the counterintelligence chief, and he told him to devise a plan on how to get Kennedy. And I think John Newman talks about in his book, Oswald and the CIA, essentially what James Jesus Angleton's job was to reduce the alarms that protected the president. He was to create the cover story. He was to manufacture the profile of the patsy and manipulate who later the patsy ended up being as Lee Harvey Oswald. He was also part of the cover-up. I also think that the mid-level people that were involved included David Atlee Phillips, who was the head of the Cuban operations. He was also involved in trying to undermine the Fair Play for Cuba Committee that had a lot of support in Latin and South America, and actually their headquarters were in New York City. I think he was one of the handlers for Lee Harvey Oswald, and in fact, if you know, Antonio Viciana indicated that he was at a meeting 2 months before 2 months before Daley Plaza and the assassination in Dallas with, he knew the person as Maurice Bishop and Lee Harvey Oswald. And because of the declassification of many documents and the work of Gaetan Fonzi, did I have him right, who wrote the last investigation, and because of Antonio Viciana's affidavit that he signed in 2014, we now know that Maurice Bishop was actually David Atlee Phillips. So I think David Atlee Phillips was one of the handlers for Lee Harvey Oswald. And then, of course, you'd be remiss to omit the New Orleans connection. I also think that people that were involved in the assassination and were watching Oswald very closely was Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and Sergio Acacia Smith, who was the head of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, which had been created by David Atlee Phillips and E. Howard Hunt. And then, of course, at the bottom were the mechanics. And the mechanics, we can argue over who was, I think Jim Mars said Roscoe White might have been the guy on the grassy knoll. I know that they arrested someone outside the Dallas Tex building who was a known mafia hitman. They only detained him briefly and then let him go for some reason, which is bizarre, because they had empty floors on the second. They had empty rooms on the second floor in which somebody could have shot from. And if you remember Sherry Feister's book, she said that the bullet that entered the lower right-hand back of Governor Conley came in at a 22-degree angle, which meant that the elevation of the shooter must have been around 20-25 feet. And what would that be? That would be a second floor height. And so the bullet could have come from the second floor of the Dow Tex building. So those are the people that I think were involved. And the reasons why they felt compelled to do this wasn't necessarily that they just personally hated President Kennedy, although some of them did, like William Harvey, who was the head of the assassination programs and ran ZR Rifle and Task Force W, that were all part of the assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. And I believe, as David Talbot does, that he was involved somehow. He may have been involved in gathering some of the people that were shooters or professional mechanics in Daley Plaza. Essentially, why they were doing this is that President Kennedy was undermining everything that they zealously believed in, and they essentially felt that what he was doing was amounting to treason. He was essentially engaging in a policy of appeasement, no worse than what Chamberlain did with Hitler in 1938 in Munich. That's how they viewed it. And what were those policies? Just quickly, essentially he was seeking rapprochement with Castro. He was trying to solve that problem peacefully in 1963. He was seeking to end the Cold War peacefully without a war, with the Soviet Union, and he was planning to reopen. He was planning to open normal relations with China if he could in his second term, just like Nixon and Kissinger did in 1972, only 10 years earlier. And he was, supporting people like Sukarno in terms of getting rid of the shackles of colonialism and becoming independent, autonomous nations that were completely unified. He was doing the same thing in the Congo. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back for this group of people was when he decided to withdraw from Vietnam.
And this has been Richard Otto. He's the author of The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republic. Hey, Richard, we'll have you on again in the future to talk about everything in the post-JFK years. And thank you very much for being on with us tonight.
Hey, thank you very much.
I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back with Ralph Epperson. On episode 005 of the Midnight Rider News Show, we were honored to have one of the leading JFK assassination researchers on the show. Jim DiEugenio of KennedysandKing.com joined us to discuss his entrance into the JFK assassination research community, the case and trial of Jim Garrison, Oliver Stone's JFK, the poor JFK-related work done by Vincent Bugliosi and Tom Hanks, the 2017 JFK records releases, as well as comments on James Files, the Three Hobos, and whether he believes it was Rafael Cruz in New Orleans with Lee Harvey Oswald. Listen to Jim DiEugenio on episode 005 of the Midnight Rider News Show today. Ralph Epperson is a historian, author, and lecturer who's been researching the conspiratorial view of history, which is the view that major events of the past have been planned years in advance by a central conspiracy, for over 50 years. He's written important works such as 1985's The Unseen Hand, 1990's The New World Order, and 2005's Jesse James, United States Senator. He's also produced 15 DVDs, which can be found at ralph-epperson.com. That's Ralph, R-A-L-P-H, hyphen, Epperson, E-P-P-E-R-S-O-N.com. And now, I want to put in a special plug for the 27-hour Unseen Hand video series, a very nice work. He's a graduate of the University of Arizona, but he freely admits that what he has learned since graduation has taught him that most of what he learned in college in history and political science was simply not true. He proudly states that his research has proven to him that there's been an active conspiracy in the world planning major wars, depressions, and inflationary periods years in advance. I came to know Ralph Epperson through reading The Unseen Hand in the early 1990s, as well as through his many appearances on Frank Whalen's Frankly Speaking radio show. Like William Cooper, John Lear, Gary Allen, or Mae Brussel, Ralph is from an earlier generation of important researchers. And as you all know, I believe it's vital to pay tribute to that generation of researchers, as they also kindly paved the way for us to do what we do today. So tonight, live from Arizona, we give you Ralph Epperson. Ralph, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. Thank you very much. How about yourself?
I am well. Thanks for asking, Ralph. Now, I've listened to you since you were on Frankly Speaking with Frank Whalen, which was the early 2000s. And I read The Unseen Hand in college, so it's a real honor to have you on tonight. Thank you so much for being on.
Well, you're very kind. I always appreciate anybody that's willing to give me an audience, because I've dedicated my life to education, and I try to make my stuff easy to understand and very pertinent, and talk about the issues that the American people are concerned about. And that's what I'll be doing tonight as well.
How did you first become interested in and involved with the alternative side of history?
Well, I'm a college graduate, as you'll read on my bio, and I didn't know anything at all about this, not even jokingly. And so I went to California after my college 4 years was over, and I got a job, and I joined the Young Republicans. I'll make it very brief. And I went there, and the guy says, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I'm here to learn how to vote on Prop 101 and which judge and which governor." He said, "No, you're not. You're here to read." And he gave me a book to read called None Dare Call It Treason. I read that book and said, my goodness, this guy is right. It was a brilliant little book, sold multiple millions of copies. And so that's what started. I read that one, and then suddenly people recommended other materials. I read, and as I was reading, I discovered that there was a conspiracy at work, and that was way back in 1963. So it's quite a number of years ago, but I just kept reading until I got up to 1,100 books.
In 1985, you wrote The Unseen Hand, an introduction to the conspiratorial view of history. Now, it's really a fascinating work, Ralph, in that it's sort of a textbook of conspiracy. What motivated you to write The Unseen Hand?
Well, I was, in 1973, I was speaking around the city. In fact, I did a part-time talk show on a radio station. And a friend of mine asked me to come on and to a community college and lecture to his class. And I did so, and he called me about a month later and said, listen, Epperson, you don't know, we're still talking about what you presented. And not only that, but the way you presented it. And I said, well, how? He says, you're a natural teacher. I said, I don't know. No, I'm not. He said, no, I'm serious. We're going to get you to teach here. So he got me to teach one class called Consumer Economics, but I was paid by the state of Oregon to teach conspiracy. So I did, and my students loved it. And they said, you got to put this in a book. It took me 12 years to write The Unseen Hand. I published it in 1985 from my lecture notes in my classes.
Let's go back to the discovery of America. How early do we see secret societies cropping up in the land that would eventually be the United States?
You can go back to start with 1620 and read the Mayflower Compact. These were the people on board the Mayflower who came to America for religious freedom. And they committed this nation to Jesus Christ. And a few years later, another group came to America called the Order of the Quest. And they came to take it away. And that's when it started. This nation was betrayed by our founding fathers. And it'll take a few minutes to explain, but I can do so if you wish. Our founding fathers gave Congress total, unlimited power in the Constitution. That's how bad it is.
And how did they do that?
Well, that's the question that we'll have to explain. I want to go back to 1766 to a thing called the Declaratory Act. It was a piece of legislation issued by the Parliament in England, and it gave King George the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever, which is tyranny. All means all. It doesn't mean except on Thursdays, or all meaning 50%, or subject to restrictions. All means all. And the legislation pointed out that it was intended to bind the people of America and the states. Bind means to control, tie down. So they were using the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever, and we lived under that for 10 years. And then in 1776, our founding fathers decided to break with England, and we declared our independence. And I want to read just very briefly from the Declaration of Independence. The last two sentences. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Absolute. Tyranny is absolute power. So they're not saying just absolute power, it's absolute power. Then they said, to prove it, let us be submitted to the candid world. So they're going to tell the people of the world, here's why we were doing this. And the 22nd of those lists, there's about 25 or 30 of them, the 22nd one that says that King George was guilty of suspending our own legislatures, meaning he dissolved them, and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. They just admitted that phrase, our founding fathers, the 56 men who signed the Declaration, knew what that meant. To legislate in all cases whatsoever was an absolute tyranny. There is no end to that power. None. All means all. It means it today. It means it last year. It means it in the 1880s. I jokingly say if Jesse James held you up on a train and asked for all your money, he didn't mean 50%. He wanted all. All means all. Now, here's where they pulled the strand. I'm making this very brief. We wrote the Constitution 1787, and we divided the power between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. which means that we were granting 3 branches of government to divide the power because we didn't want anyone to have too much. And they had a check, they called it a checks and balances. So in other words, one got too powerful, the others would step up. But let's read what they gave our Congress in the Constitution. Article 1 creates the legislative department. That's the agency that's going to write the laws. And it says all legislative powers herein granted. And then they list the granted powers in Section 8. There are 17 of them. And I'll just briefly cover the first 16. Congress should have the power to collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, establish a uniform naturalization, I'm making it brief, coin money, punish counterfeiting, post offices, promote science, constitute tribunals, punish piracy, declare war, raise armies, etc. And then this 16, they call forth the militia. Now, notice there's nothing in there about building space telescopes, nothing in there about foreign aid, nothing about aid to education, nothing about welfare, until you read the 17th one. The other listed are delegated specifically. The power to raise an army doesn't give you the power to fund education. So now let's read the 17th. Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever. Now there's more to that, but let's just stop right there. They gave Congress the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. 10 years before, 11 years before, they said that was the power of absolute tyranny because King George was granted that power and we declared it to be an absolute tyranny. Yet they gave Congress the same power. And I want to know why. And you should want to know why. Anyone should want to know why. I'll read it again. Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever. They use the same words 3 times now. Declaratory Act 1766, Declaration of Independence 1776, and now the Constitution in 1787. That means they've got total, unlimited, unrestricted power. All power. Because they were evil men. Because when we declared this nation to be dedicated to Jesus, they wanted to declare it with a different purpose. In fact, I've produced a 4-hour DVD called America's Secret Destiny. They committed this nation to a secret destiny. It's on the back of our dollar bill. If you flip your dollar bill over, I know we're going very quickly through this, but we can see what our secret destiny is. You go to the back of the dollar bill, there's 2 circles. Those 2 circles constitute the Great Seal of the United States. Now, a seal was used by kings and other forms of government. They would take a document and fold it and then put melted wax on a spot, say about the size of a 50-cent piece, and then as it cooled, they would stick the ring, the king would stick his ring in it to make it official. That's what a seal became, an evidence of an official declaration or treaty or a letter or whatever it was. And secondly, if it was broken, someone got it before it got to the party it was addressed to, it would break. And it would be impossible to stick it back together again and get it warmed and heated without obliterating the seal. But we have 2 seals. Why? We don't need 2 seals. Yes, we do. Manly P. Hall told us the second seal conceals our secret destiny. And I'll make it very brief. It's in the Latin phrases around the pyramid on the back of our dollar bill in the Great Seal of the United States. Annuit septus novus ordo seclorum. Annuit, announcing. Septus, the conception of, or the birth of, novus, new, ordo, order, seclorum, world. Announcing the birth of the New World Order. 1782. It was 1990 when George Bush mentioned it, but our founding fathers committed us to it in 1782 when they unanimously designed the Great Seal of the United States.
Moving into that American War for Independence, how does the conspiratorial view of the war contrast with the textbook view of the war?
We can do it very briefly. The purpose of the war was to force America to spend a lot of money, spend a lot of time fighting it, and losing and winning in small battles, and then how are the United States going to pay for it? Well, we don't have any taxing power. Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 or 2 gives them the power to tax, but they're all specific, like for patents or imposts or something. So we didn't have a power to do it, and that's why they wanted a long war, costly war, so the government would have to borrow money. And guess what? The King of England said, or the Bank of England said, we'll loan you the money to pay for it. And no, we created our first central bank, like the Federal Reserve, in 1816. So we borrowed the money, paid off the debt, and then paid off the interest from whatever taxes we could get. And that's what started. The war took a long time to fight, and they sent their admirals and generals over here, and armies and everybody else, and fought, and it took time. It took years for them to finally declare a winner. So that's what it was, to create a central bank. And they wanted it to be a permanent central bank. But it didn't. It lasted for 20 years. So that's a good part to end with in that segment. The war was fought to be very expensive and very time-consuming.
What were the banks of the United States?
Let's cover the first one. It lapsed in 1812. And then they created the second bank in 1816. So the first one was from 1792 to 1812. 20 years, that's right. Okay, so it lasted for 20 years, and then Monroe made sure it wasn't renewed. So the English government, the Bank of England, created the War of 1812. The very year that the first bank lapsed, they created a war to force us into fighting it, making it expensive. It lasted for 4 years or so. And then when that war was over, then we created the second bank of the United States with a 20-year charter. There was a compromise between those who said, give us a permanent bank, and those who said, well, we'll take a 20-year period. So it'll expire, and Jackson ran in 1832 for re-election with a very simple platform, Jackson and no bank, or bank and no Jackson. If you want the bank, vote for my opponent. If you don't want, vote for me. They did. They voted Jackson back in, and Jackson killed the bank. So that took care of the second bank of the United States.
Now, Ralph, I've always been kind of conflicted about Andrew Jackson. I'll read some biographies, and I'll find him very likable and very good on policy. And then I'll read some, and he's just horrendous. So what's your opinion on Andrew Jackson in general?
Well, that's really about all I know. First of all, remember this: the textbooks and history books are written by the victor, the one who wins. So if Jackson was a real hero, they're going to write books to make him out to be a hero. It's like you're doing with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln also outfoxed the bankers, and now they're talking about he had all sorts of problems, and his wife was crazy, and he was into seances and everything else. But they've got to discredit those who fought the central bank and their platform. So that's why Jackson and Lincoln are being criticized for doing all sorts of things. So all I know is he took on the bank, he did what he was promised, and the bank lapsed. But then, are you ready for the third step?
Absolutely.
1837, the European bankers created a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. And the Knights of the Golden Circle was funded by the European bankers who sent people over to America. And the reason they did so was they wanted another war to force the North, or the United States government, into a central bank again, this time making it big and more expensive and last longer. So they created it. It took them 24 years to generate enough of an issue to get the South to secede. But they did it over the issue of slavery. And the reason they wanted the Knights to do their job was because America was building a merchant marine and a navy between 1832 or so and 1836. So England said, and France said, we can't fight an army 3,000 miles away if America has an ocean, a navy, so we better find some other issue. Well, there's a good one. How about slavery? Slavery was not the cause of the war. It was the purpose of the war. They got the brother to fight brother, get the South to secede, and then the North and the South would fight a battle. Because Canada and Mexico were on our continent, but neither one was big enough. They couldn't bribe Canada or Mexico to fight a war, so they decided to get brother to fight brother, state against state. Lincoln saw the secession developing and decided to try to protect it, protect the Union, and the war started in 1861, 24 years after the 1837 beginning of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Now, before we get into the American Civil War, I want to ask you about the Rothschilds, because I think the stories are going to intertwine here at some point. For those who have never heard the name Rothschild, or even for those who have heard the name many times but know very little about them, who are the Rothschilds and how did they accumulate so much power?
Well, I want to intercede here and offer you another option. There are 12 banking families. The Rothschilds are only one of 12. Now, let me tell you this. I've studied this stuff for over 50 years of my life. I've read everything on both sides that I can, to over probably 1,200 books by now, on both sides. And I kept hearing about the Rothschilds. And later on, I stumbled onto the Warburgs with a smaller percentage, so they're also another banking family. And I once found the Seligmans in funding either the North or the South. Probably the South. So those are the first three banking families that I found out. Dr. Carroll Quigley wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope in 1966, while Bill Clinton was at Georgetown University. So Bill Clinton was asked to read this book. We can now read what Bill Clinton read to learn there was a conspiracy. And in that book, Quigley pointed out, PhD from Harvard, he pointed out that there were 12 banking families, and he named them. When I read that, I recognized only 3 of the 12 names, or 4. The Morgans, the Rothschilds, the Seligmans, and who else? One more. And so there was 4 of them, and the other 8 I had never heard of before. But I'm telling you, those 12 that Quigley found, I believe, are really the truth. So they're only one of 12. Now, what the Morgans and the Rothschilds are supposed to be out in the front so we can throw stones at them, blame them for all this stuff, and all the time this is going on, they're only one of 12. Their job is to take the abuse, get the rocks thrown at you, tomatoes, and all the hate, and then the other 11 go through history without even being known.
Ralph, who is Albert Pike?
Oh, he's a real mystery man. We need to know more about this man. And that's fact, in 1985, I first was introduced to him, not by name, because he died in 1891. But someone urged me to read the book Morals and Dogma. Morals and Dogma was one of the many books written by Albert Pike, but it used to be given out to the Masons at the 14th degree. Now, let me briefly, for those who don't know who the Masons are, let me briefly summarize. When you join the Masons, you go through 3 rituals. I'll make it as brief as I can. And when you're through 3 of them, one at a time, separated by time, you become a Master Mason, and you can stop there if you wish. You don't have to go on. But you're a Master Mason, you can call yourself a Mason, and you'll go to lodge meetings. Now, if you want to go on, there's the Scottish rite, like Scotland, Scottish rite of 29 more for a total of obviously of 32. There's a thing called the York rite, which they claim is the Christian rite of the Masons. I can find very little out about them, but there's 10 more there for a total of 13. So it's 32 or 13. Then above that is a degree called the 33rd, which is honorary. You don't become a 33rd unless you're invited to become a 33rd. Barry Goldwater was a 33rd degree Mason, which means he was invited to become a Mason by the 33rd degree council in Washington, D.C. So now, the Masons, Albert Pike was the sovereign grand commander of worldwide Masonry from 1859 to 1891. And the reason I believe that is there's a statue of him in Washington, D.C. Now, the statue's very tall. He's probably 8 feet tall and is on a podium maybe another 8 feet, so it's pretty tall. The whole thing probably 15, 16 feet high. So it's a good size. So he's there. Now, the plaque at the bottom of it says that he was the Sovereign Grand Commander and leader of the worldwide Masonic movement from 1859 to 1891, 32 years. The book, Morals and Dogma, you're supposed to read it as a Mason, but it tells you that there's a secret that they're going to conceal from you and not reveal, but they want you to read and ponder and reflect, and maybe you'll be able to figure it out, and if you do, you could become a 33rd. Now, that book, by the way, Pike wrote all of the rituals. You can read the 4th through the 32nd in a book called Magnum Opus. You can get it. It's not something you're going to find in the local bookstore, but if you want it, there's a way to just go Google it and buy it and read the rituals yourself.
Was Albert Pike ever the head of the Knights of the Golden Circle?
No, that's not true. The KGC, Knights of the Golden Circle, was created in Europe, and I've read various estimates. The first book I read said 14,000 members, but a more recent book said 200,000 members of non-uniformed Union troops, in essence, because they were leading revolutions and urging people to secede from the South. But Pike never became the leader. He was the legal counsel for the Knights of the Golden Circle. And also, by the way, for the Ku Klux Klan, which was created after the Civil War. And we can cover that in another minute if you wish. But the Knights of the Golden Circle dissolved in 1903, stayed in effect from 1865 to 1903, and then was dissolved and done away with. It doesn't exist as far as I can tell today.
So let's talk about how the banking families influenced President Lincoln.
Okay, let's do that. Let's go back. Lincoln had to finance the war. Once again, it's going to be an expensive war. These are not going to be people firing muskets. We're going to have cannon and horses and food and bullets and powder and everything else. So it's going to be a little more expensive. So it's going to be very expensive. It's going to cost a lot of money. So Lincoln had to face the problem in 1861. How do I pay for it? And guess who showed up? The European bankers. And they said to Lincoln, hey, this is, of course, the Epperson's Hollywood version. Hey, Lincoln, we noticed you got this war. Oh, yes, I do. How are you going to pay for it, Lincoln? I don't know. They said, oh, Lincoln, by the way, we're in the banking business. We can loan you the money. Hey, that's a good idea. I can get the money and pay for my soldiers and the bullets and everything else. What kind of interest would you want? 36%. Oh, okay. Thanks a lot. Don't call me, I'll call you. And he left. And Lincoln printed the greenback dollar, which was not borrowed, and saved America multiple billions of dollars in interest. Lincoln. So what happened?
Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865.
You bet. Who killed him? John Wilkes Booth, member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Confirmed several times now. All sorts of books writing about them doing far more research than I did when I discovered the Knights way back in 1965. So the bankers they took Lincoln out, I think, as a way of saying, don't do that, any future presidents, because if you do, you won't live to make the next day.
Now, there have been stories for years that John Wilkes Booth was actually not captured at the Garrett farm, but instead escaped. So, do you believe he was captured?
No, he was not. There's more than abundant evidence that he was allowed to escape. Okay, let's go back. The people that planned the assassination, the people down in the trenches, there were like 8 of them. Booth is only one. They planned on assassinating 4 men that night. Vice President Johnson, not Andrew Johnson. This was Jackson. This was, I guess, Andrew Johnson. Secretary of State Seward, Grant, and one more. And boy, I'll tell you, I'm doing this from memory. I can't think of the other one, but maybe in a minute. If they had killed all 4 of those men, that's right, Grant, Seward, Johnson, and Lincoln. That's those 4. If those 4 men had been assassinated that night, and plans were to make sure that they were, who would become president? There was nothing in writing about it. And guess who volunteered? Edwin P. Stanton. Stanton was invited by Lincoln to go to Ford's Theater. the night to celebrate the war was over, only a couple of days, and Lincoln invited Stanton to go with him, his Secretary of War, as a way of saying the war's over now. Stanton was too busy, so he couldn't go. So he invited Grant, and Grant was seen, the newspapers reported, with his wife in a carriage at breakneck speed getting out of the city. So now we got Booth jumping to the stage and then running out the back door to a horse already waiting for him, and then he got on horseback and ran. Now, there's only 8 roads out of Washington, D.C., and guess what? Stanton, since he was Secretary of the War, could still order troops around. He ordered that 7 of those roads be protected by troops, and the one that he missed, strangely enough, was called Navy Yard Bridge. And it was a wooden bridge over the, I guess, Potomac or something, gets you into Maryland, which would get you into Virginia. Just by coincidence, and that's the one that Booth took. Booth was captured, no, was not captured, but they got another man in the barn and made sure that he was killed, and then Stanton went down there and certified that the man was John Wilkes Booth, and it was not. Clearly, abundantly, evidence-wise, there's no question it wasn't him, but Stanton said it was, so they buried Booth in an army post where no one could dig it up again, not even his family. So now, Booth lived until 1903, and I went to Granbury, Texas, and the Granbury, Texas Chamber of Commerce talks about Booth working in a saloon in that town and admitting that he was, but people wouldn't believe him, and finally he left. So there's a connection. But this opens up another door. Jesse James, the famous outlaw, lived to be 103, and he became the head of the Knights of the Golden Circle, probably in about 1870 or 1885, 75, something like that. And he kept it until 1903, and then they dissolved it.
Now, Ralph, some of your more fascinating work over the years deals with the life of Jesse James, who you claim was a U.S. Senator and, as you just said, lived to be 103. Now, take us through the Jesse James story, please.
Another man was shot. Let's start with that. And he got the wife to admit it was, to tell the sheriff it was Jesse James. But the question is far more interesting. In 1863, after the Civil War started, Frank James, in 1862, his older brother, joined Quantrell's Raiders. And they were, I guess, not directly connected for the South, but they were raiding towns and stealing money and gold and shooting people. And so the Union Army wanted to know where they were. And they believed, they heard that Frank James was in the squad, and they knew where Jesse and Frank lived in Kearney, Missouri. So they went to the farm, a small squad of 8 men, primarily apparently local men, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So they said to the father, first of all, the stepfather, where's Frank James? I'm not going to tell you, I don't know. Yes, you'd better tell us. So they tried to hang him, and he wouldn't talk. They raised him up and hung him, and then they said, wait a minute, they saw Jesse come around the corner. They said, well, he won't talk, we'll get Jesse to talk. And so Jesse, he was 16 years old, came around the corner and said, put my father down. He got him down, and then they hung him. And Jesse James, even when he died, still had rope burns around his neck. They raised him up, beat him around the head and shoulders, and then actually burned his feet. And that's a very important detail for much later. So Jesse wouldn't talk either. So they finally said, we can't get any truth out of these two guys. The doctor, the stepfather of Jesse and Frank, was a medical doctor, and because of a lack of oxygen from that point on, he was nothing more than wasn't able to function, be a doctor anymore. So it was pretty serious. So Jesse found out who 2 of those men were. They lived in a neighboring town, maybe 30 miles away, called Holt, Missouri. So Jesse went up there and apparently found him and shot and killed him in 1864. And you can find their tombstones in the Haynesville Cemetery a few miles outside of Holt, Missouri. Now, these 2 guys were named Bigelow. They both were within a year or 2 of each other, so it's presumably they were both brothers. We don't know for sure. They could have been, two uncles or something, but they were both named Bigelow, and Jesse found and shot them and killed them both. Now, one of those men, or maybe if they were uncles, the nephew found out that Jesse killed him from Kearney, and he said, I'm going to go kill him in 1964. Well, he tried to do that, and he said, listen, I learned shortly afterwards that it was Jesse James, and Jesse had a reputation of being very good with the gun, and the son, let's call him a son just for the sake of argument, the son said, I couldn't go up against Jesse. I know what I'll do. I'll infiltrate his gang and then tell the Pinkerton Detective Agency what their plans are, and then I'm going to run like the Dickens, and they'll kill Jesse for me. And then I'll avenge my two uncles. So that worked. He went with them to the Northfield raid in Wisconsin, and he was ordered to guard the bridge if anyone came through, to stop them from coming into town so they could rob the town. Well, as soon as they got shooting and found out there was people shooting at the people, that the robbers, this guy named Charlie Bigelow ran. He went back to Missouri and picked up living in a town called St. Joseph, Missouri, which is maybe 30, 40 miles away from Kearney. And then Jesse found out that he was the one who killed he was the son who wanted to kill him. So when he found out that he was the one that told Pinkerton where the gang was going, and therefore three of his fighters, two or three, I can't remember now, were both killed. So the fact that Bigelow infiltrated and then ratted on them resulted with dead gang members in Jesse's gang. So Jesse now decided to kill Charlie Bigelow. He found him in St. Joseph and killed him early in the morning, came into the barn adjacent to the house, shot him in the head, dragged the body into the house, and Mrs. Bigelow came running down and said, you shot my husband. Yes, and I want you to call the sheriff, get the sheriff called over, and tell the man on the floor is Jesse James. There was a $10,000 reward out for him. Now, he bribed his cousins. Bob and Charlie Ford were cousins of Jesse and Frank. I don't have the direct connection so far, but I've read that repeatedly, that they were kinfolk. And they were going to collect the $10,000 reward and claim that Bigelow was the real Jesse and that they shot him. Okay, so now we got Bigelow's dead. Jesse went on to lived to be 103. That's a whole other story. That's how the story came down. By the way, Jesse became a 33rd degree Mason by invitation, and I believe they knew who he was when they invited him.
That is quite a story.
Isn't that something? Wait till you hear the rest of the story. If you want to get this, there's a 4-hour DVD. It's on sale in my DVDs, like $10 or $12, 4 hours, to cover the story in ways you've never heard before. Jesse James was a major player, and I mean major. He was called the wealthiest man in the world, legitimately, when he was powerful. He was called one of 100 men who rule America. Jesse James, under the alias of William Andrews Clark. And wait till you see the proof I've got that Jesse James was William Andrews Clark. It's an incredible story. By the way, just if I may, let's go back. The DVD's called Jesse James Lived to Be 103. It's available in my catalog, and when you get a pen and paper, right down my website, go there and order it, and I guarantee it's going to blow your mind.
That and the rest of Ralph's collection can be found at ralph-epperson.com. ralph-epperson.com, and I would suggest everyone go there.
Thank you.
So, Ralph, if you're ready, let's move into the 20th century.
By the way, I want to go back to one thing about the Civil War. It might take a couple of minutes. We're out of sequence. Let's go back. The North realized that the way to win the war was to blockade the South. The South did not have the technology, the industry to make guns and rifles and bullets. So they were importing all of that from England and France, our great allies, to the South. So Lincoln realized the way to win the war was to blockade the South with ships. You stick them in the ocean, and boy, if any not gun runners, but blockade runners coming in, you stop the ship, and if it's taking goods into the South, you sink it. And so, but he didn't have enough of a navy, so he looked around and said, "I need some help." And he looked at maybe someone in Europe can help us. And he found only one nation without a central bank, and that was Russia. Russia, the same Russia that people are commenting about colluding with Trump. That same Russia sent its navy to the waters of the North, not only the Pacific Ocean, but the eastern coast as well. They went into various cities and got ready, and their admirals were ordered. They opened up orders while they were at sea that they were to take orders only from Lincoln or any of his generals or admirals, and that they were to intercede anytime that one of the American ships was in trouble or they were in battle. They were to go and sink the enemy. And once that England and France learned that they were taking contracts from the South to build blockade-running ships with massive cannons, way bigger than anything the United States had or even Russia, they decided that the fact that Russia was now involved was too much of a risk because they had the largest navy in the world at the time. So they decided to cancel the orders, and the blockade started to work. The South couldn't get the weapons, couldn't get the ammunition, couldn't get the cannon, so they had to fight the war with what they had in 1863. Now, let's document that. There's two ways I use physical documentation. Number one, the city of Baltimore issued a proclamation, and I show it to you in my DVD. It welcomes them in 63, after the war's over, to come to Baltimore and receive a hero's welcome for thanks for what you did for America. The second one is Matthew Brady, the nation's best photographer, the Civil War, took literally thousands of pictures, including photos of one of the Russian ships. I think it was in Charleston, South Carolina. And you can see those on Google Brady and look up the city, and you'll see the pictures of it. So we know they were here. Now, they aided, and then they returned. Last step, we bought Alaska. We bought Alaska for $7.2 million when no one could understand why. It's a frozen ice cube. Why should we buy Alaska? Because it was owned by Russia. And we had no way to transfer money to a foreign nation except by land buying. Remember the Louisiana Purchase from France? That set the precedent. We could buy land in America, so we bought Alaska as a way of paying the Tsar for the use of the fleet. Now, I'll make one sentence. Try to find that in a history book written up to 1985. Not one, over probably 50 books I looked into as I was doing research into the Civil War, not one of them mentions that. Why? None of them mentioned Russia. You want to talk about history as being fake news, read The Unseen Hand for all of the fake news that I've uncovered to show you that we've been lied to. Our history is not what it claimed to be.
Regarding World War I and World War II, Ralph, what is it that we don't know and can't know from mainstream textbooks? What were the real causes of both wars?
Okay, the premise was that we needed a world government. That's the way we fought World War I. So they decided to have a world war. Normally it's one nation attacking another, and maybe after that one then one goes against someone else, or maybe two join against one, but never a world where a lot of nations were involved. And the purpose of World War I was to convince the world that nations cause wars, so if we create a world government and abolish nationalism, we'll have no more war. What a beautiful thought. And Woodrow Wilson kept talking about the war to make the world safe for democracy. No more nations. A beautiful world was good. So after the war was over, they signed the Treaty of Versailles to end the war. Woodrow Wilson, our president, signed it, brought it back to the United States, and the Senate refused to ratify it. We don't want no stinking world government. So that didn't work. Woodrow Wilson toured the country trying to get the popular support. That failed, and so as soon as the war was over, the First World War was over, within a year or two, Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Winston Churchill started planning World War II. 30-some years before it started, 20-some years before it started. Wait a minute. Why would they want to do that? To give a bigger world war with more nations involved, to convince the world that, look, you wouldn't listen to us in World War I, so guess what? These conspiring nations started a second world war. And nations, once we create the world government, we can abolish nationalism. So the way to get America involved, because America does not go into war unless we're provoked, our government, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, plotted the sinking of the Lusitania, one of those big ocean-going vessels. It left England, left the United States, went to England, and there would Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, in other words, the admiral of the head of the Admiralty of the whole English government, ordered the Lusitania to stop as it got in the southern end of the island known as England, and he was going to send a destroyer there to protect it from submarines. All the time, Winston Churchill knew the U-20, a submarine, was in the waters right away, just a short distance from the Lusitania, and when the Hood didn't show up, because Winston Churchill canceled the orders, the captain of the U-boat sunk the Lusitania with Americans on board, and when they went down, we demand, look what those Germans did to those to that ship. They sunk it and Americans died. We got to fight. So we got into World War I. Yeah, that's right. World War I was Lusitania. So then, that's right. That got us into World War I. Forgive me. Now, the second war was they started planning World War II. Churchill, Woodrow Wilson, and Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and they started planning another war. So now we needed another major event to convince us to go to war again, to create the nations to fight it off, and we'd have a United Nations. So now we need another war started. Well, we started in 1939, but in Europe. And the American people didn't want anything to do with that stinking war. So we said, no, don't enter it. So now Roosevelt had to plan a way to get us into the war. So he decided to use Pearl Harbor. In the late 30s, our government was putting pressure on Japan as an island by blockading it, because it was fighting in China or something. So we blockaded it, and Japan needed raw materials. So we prevented that. So Japan said, we'll show you, we'll sink your fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now, Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor because he helped plan it in 1919. In 1932, our Navy conducted a naval exercise at Pearl Harbor to find out the way to attack it. If you're ever going to attack it, they attacked it from the north via airplanes, and they invited the Japanese Admiralty to come watch the exercise. What? 1932, 9 years before it, we didn't invite the Australians or the Canadians or the French, so the Japanese Admiralty came and saw, wait a minute, we can attack 9 years later from the north. Then the Japanese government put spies into the United States, into Pearl Harbor, and they reported back they've done nothing to protect the northern shore. So guess what? Japan attacked from the north, from the sea, and they sunk and damaged 8. There were 8, I think 8 or 9. I think it was 9. 9 battleships in the port. They were all lined up side by side, 2, and one was on the other side. So that's 8 tied up, 2, facing the same direction, like you would stack 2 cardboard boxes side by side, and 2 more, for a total of 8. So if you're going to attack them with an airplane with dive bombers, you start at one end and just keep bombing until you get past all 8 of them. And then Saturday morning, the Sunday before the attack, we had a inspection. all the battleships were inspected. Now, when the Navy inspects a battleship, and we might have some experts called in to confirm this, they open up the bulkhead doors so the admiral doesn't have to delay, walking from one compartment to the other. He just walks through, then goes to the next room and walks through. And those doors were not locked Sunday morning when the Japanese attacked. And they knew one of the ways they were going to attack was with torpedoes, because they had airplanes that dropped torpedoes into water. If you hit underwater with a torpedo and the water comes in, there's no way to prevent it from flooding the whole battleship. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Somebody failed to, and I don't even know why they had an inspection on a Saturday. I can't find out, but that's very strange. But they did. Last thing you need to do when you go to my website, you'll find the newspaper the Sunday before, like November the 31st or whatever it was, 30th. Japan may strike next weekend. Huh? The Sunday before the Sunday attack, they were warning people Japan's going to strike. But Roosevelt apparently didn't read the newspaper. But he was sitting in the White House waiting for the word of the Japanese attack. There's no question about that. He knew it was going to happen. So we created, out of the war, the United Nations, and then that's someplace along the line, they decided we're not going to create a world government, and that's something we can end with. We'll discuss why they don't want a world government. But the United Nations was not to be a world government. It's, 60 years old now? It's still not a world government, so it's ineffective, and it's never going to become a world government.
Now, Ralph, it seems like one of the things you can't even question historically is the Holocaust. Whenever you do, you start to get called anti-Semitic and all of these things, even if you're just trying to match older historical accounts, which is pretty commonplace in doing historiography. So what do you think about the Holocaust and its history?
Well, there's no question that's one of the things that separates people rapidly as soon as you mention that phrase. And I just, I'll be very honest with you, I just completely disregard, leave it alone. I will say the one thing I did find that seems to support the position was that I believe it was Standard Oil produced Zyklon B poison, and it is alleged, and I'll leave it at that. I do not know, and I'm not going to look into it to see whether or not it happened. So, but they claim that that's what they used in the gas chambers, in the rooms to kill these Jews, and then they gassed them with the ovens. So whether or not it happened, if you want to go to a party and mention the Holocaust didn't happen, I'm telling you, it's going to become a Donnybrook. I don't get into that issue. Just leave it alone. Because it doesn't do any good. We can't prove it one way or the other.
Right. It's just a contentious issue that gets so emotional from both sides. And it gets so emotional that it's really almost impossible to just discuss facts.
I agree. I'll be honest with you. I just completely leave it alone. I don't get into it. All I know is that I got in fact, I have pictures of it, of a barrel of it, Zyklon B gas. Now, whether or not how many they bought or used, I don't know. I just leave. Once I found out that you want to separate people, you discuss that. In fact, in Canada, it's against the law to discuss that it didn't happen. I don't want that to happen in America. I just leave it alone. If it happened, it's no question. It's one of the most barbaric events ever perpetrated on a group of people. Whether they were Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, doesn't matter. That is just despicable. I can't believe people could do that. So I say I'm not going to get into it. I leave it alone.
Now, one of the issues that we revisit quite often on the show, and one that you've actually produced a video about, is that of the JFK assassination. So,
oh boy.
What do you think really happened to JFK in Dallas, and who do you think was responsible?
Let's open that door up. The Kennedy assassination was planned in 1959. Kennedy he was elected in 1960. Okay, let's start with Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Marines and sent to Japan, wherein he learned all about the U-2, I think called the Atsugi Air Force Base. He learned about the U-2 and radar. So he was apparently found out that he was a loner. and came from a family of, no father. So he was contacted by our CIA and said, listen, we surely do not wish to tolerate the Cuban government. And as perhaps you've read, we're trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. So how would you like to be involved with that? If we can train you to go and kill Fidel Castro and then allow you to help you escape, you can come back to the United States as a great hero. So Oswald thought about that and said, great. Marina, his wife, said that Oswald loved Kennedy. He didn't want to kill Kennedy. So let's talk about that. So shortly thereafter, Oswald starts going to Russian school. Now, he's a trained radar expert. So then these fellow Marines called him Oswaldsky. But then he was allowed to travel to, I think, Copenhagen, and then get into Russia without any interference. Somebody arranged that. He didn't have any money. That's an expensive trip. Someone paid him to go. And when he got to Minsk, he was given a job working in some sort of radio factory, and his apartment was 6 blocks away from where the KGB in Russia train assassins. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? So now he's trained on how to assassinate with a pistol by the KGB. He met Marina, they got married, and they came back to this country without being questioned by the CIA, the FBI, or anyone else. He just walks back in. Once again, he went to the embassy, and they gave him money to fly back. This is unparalleled. People coming back to the United States from Russia, especially when they defected, they come back you're grilled by the day to find out what they knew or why they went. And Oswald walks back in, and then he goes to New Orleans with his wife and joins a Russian community of people living there, and they start preparing his anti-Castro image. He created a group called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was already in existence, but he got a charter, or at least got recognition as forming a charter. He was the only member, and he was photographed and videotaped handing out flyers, be fair to Castro, to show that he was an anti-communist, a pro-communist, and he was interviewed on the local TV station admitting to be a Marxist. He fired a shot at General Walker, who was a leading, very vocal anti-communist general. I think he was retired then, but he's such a great shot, he missed him with the same rifle when Walker was sitting in a chair probably 50 feet away from him, and you could see the shadow, at least through the curtains, and he missed him. But he later on fired 3 shots. Okay, so Oswald is now certified as being an a pro-communist, and so his plans were to get into Castro. Then they introduced him to the Kennedy assassination. He had no plans or knowledge of it except briefly. They got him a job at the Texas School Book Depository, and when he got the job, he was handling boxes and everything else. And the route that Kennedy took, you can check the Dallas Morning newspaper. It showed a small map of the route that it was to take from Love Field to the Trade Mart, where he landed like at 11 o'clock. He was going to take a trip in the streets of Dallas, down Main Street underneath the underpass, and then go to the Trade Mart and deliver a luncheon speech. And so the map was changed by the brother of Cabell, who was fired by Kennedy. So he had a motive in at least helping them assassinate Kennedy. So the route was transferred to the right-hand turn going north on, I think it was called Elm, and then left on Houston, or maybe I got it reversed, and go in front of the School Book Depository where allegedly Oswald fired shots. Oswald was not in the 6th floor window, not. There's photographic evidence of that fact in the Warren Commission. You can see it with your own eyes. It's called the Algens photograph. A-L-T as in terrific, G as in George, E-N-S. He was Associated Press or UPI or somebody. He's on the other side of the street as the car's coming toward. He's probably 100 feet or maybe less past, going the same direction the car, past the school book depository. He's taking a picture of the car as it just got like close, maybe 10 feet away. He took a picture, and that picture included the doorway of the school book depository in which Lee Harvey Oswald is standing. There's no question it's him. None. Now, the Warren Commission, someone pointed that out. And they said, no, that's Billy Lovelady. So they interviewed Lovelady, like in December they were doing the report. They asked him to come to the interview wearing the shirt that he wore the day of the assassination, because he also worked at the school book depository. So now, Billy Lovelady came wearing the shirt, and it was a broad stripe, probably 3 inches wide striped shirt, red and white. Now, the picture's in black and white, of course, but later on I read where it was red and white. That's got nothing to do with the picture and the man in the doorway. But when you compare the multiple pictures of Oswald later that day after he was captured, he's wearing the identical shirt and the coat, and there's various details you can see, like a V neckline, a T-shirt he's wearing, and it's a coat, it's a light jacket, and the coat's bent, and it was buckled. Those pictures show up about 4 or 5 times later with him after he was captured and brought to the Dallas Police Department. So Oswald did not shoot Kennedy. He couldn't shoot him. Now the next step was, when they found the rifle, it wasn't a Mannlicher Carcano, it was a Mauser. Eyewitnesses, including the police, saw it was marked Mauser. 7.2 mm or whatever it's called, Germany. You can't avoid that. That's what it said. No, it was the Mannlicher Carcano, because somebody bought a rifle for him under an alias of Lee Harvey Oswald, and that's the rifle he shot him with. Now, I won't go past that. Now, let's finish the story. Oswald he's looking at Kennedy's car. That's clear in the picture, which means he looked past the first shot, because Kennedy's hands are already up against his neck when this picture was taken. It might have been a second later, but anyway, Oswald's looking at Kennedy. So he apparently heard the first shot. But then he disappeared. Why? If he was innocent, why didn't he stand and say, wait a minute, they're shooting at the president. I want to watch this. He disappeared. He walked back into the school. The only way I can explain that is, that means they're setting up, they knew he was going to assassinate him, and they said, I got to get out of here because I got to get to the Dallas Theater so I can be picked up and flown to Cuba. Huh? What? Nobody's talking about this except Epperson. Why? So now, he walks out the door. Oh, by the way, the policeman runs in. Oswald's seen inside the little, Coke machine room, snack bar thing, maybe, cookies and candy and stuff. And he's drinking a Coca-Cola with a gun, policeman with a gun in his hand. He's calm and collected, not out of breath after running 6 floors of the stairway. There's all sorts of evidence that he never was up there. He didn't run. Then he walks out, and within minutes of him walking out, someone cuts in on the Dallas police station and said, look out for the subject wearing so-and-so, 5'11". They didn't even know if Oswald was in the building or not. But somebody knew, and somebody went on the Dallas Police Network. They had 2 radios. There's a clip, and you can just listen to it. So within seconds, he probably just walked out the front door, and someone was notifying that he was the one. Oswald walked. They claimed he shot Officer Tippett. The proof is that he did not. He did not. He wasn't even near the place. He couldn't be there in time to do it. And then he got into the theater. And guess who was in the theater? Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby? Ruby knew Oswald? Yes. Strippers at the Carousel Club saw Oswald and Ruby together numerous times, but they didn't know each other and strippers, by the way, suddenly decide to commit suicide after making that public. I could keep going, but that's enough. Now, if you want to talk about why he was killed, that's another story.
Yes, I would absolutely like to hear why you believe John F. Kennedy was killed. Absolutely.
Oh, well, I'll start with this. There's a movie out called Executive Action. I would urge you to find it and watch it. Are you familiar with it?
I sure am.
Okay, help me and just confirm what I'm about to say. The movie was made by the liberal left. Burt Lancaster and who else? These three guys that were in the movie, they're all at least known liberals in Washington. So this is their story. And they talked about the Kennedys were starting a series of 8-year presidents, 4 of them. And they couldn't control Kennedy. So let's nip it in the bud. That's the first clue that there is more to this story than meets the eye. So let's talk about that. Let's go with that before we get into the who did it later. We know this. Joseph Kennedy, the father of the 4 brothers, what's his name? John, I can't, his first name's father was John, no, anyway, whatever the father's name was, I can't think of it right now.
The father was Joseph P. Kennedy.
Joseph, thank you. Joseph Kennedy raised more money in 1932 for Franklin Roosevelt than any other American. And he was rewarded for doing that by Franklin by naming him the ambassador to England. That's the #1 ambassadorship job anywhere in the world. All the others are pale compared to that. That's the best one. So he's over there, and he's working for 6 years, from 1932 to 1938. And he comes back to Washington, D.C. to meet with Roosevelt and say, Roosevelt, there's an election coming up in 1940, and I've decided to run for the presidency, and I would like very much for you to endorse me, support me, and so I can become president. And he's very naive. So Franklin said, no, Joseph, I can't do that. I'm going to run myself. And, of course, this is the Hollywood version. And Joseph said, wait a minute, everybody knows it's for 8 years, then you get out. George Washington set the precedent. No, I'm going to run for the 3rd term. Now, the reason he was going to do that was because when the war was over, Roosevelt was promised the presidency of the world government, that he believed they were going to create the United Nations. That's why he decided to run in 1940, again in 44. So Roosevelt had a motive. He knew the war was going to happen. He would go through it, leading it for 8 more years, and then take the presidency. So anyway, so now Joseph goes back to London and said, I can't be president. Joseph Jr., the older brother, and said, I'm going to make you president after the war's over. Because Joseph had money, abundant money. So he said, I'll make you president. So Joseph Jr., quote, volunteered, unquote, for a very strange, he was a B-24 bomber in England, preparatory to going across the channel to evade Europe to conquer Germany. So they got him to volunteer, that's the word they use, volunteer, to fly a B-24, take with everything that weighed something in there could be taken out, and then loaded with explosives. And then it would fly down south along, it was up in northern England, some Air Force base, fly south like into London, and then cross the channel. And when it got too close to France, Joseph Jr. would bail out, and then the plane would be remote controlled and down into Calais, I think it was, or some city where the Germans had a V1 rocket base. They were launching V1 rockets over the bomb. And so the way they're going to take it out is with a bomber loaded with explosives. But Joseph Jr. never made it. The plane exploded over the English Channel. And so no one knows how deep the water was. No one's ever gone down to find out. The History Channel did a very interesting documentary on this story, and I've got it on tape. And I'm going to make this, I'm going to try to explain something, and it's like a cartoon. It's a very accurate cartoon, but it's drawn. So here's like a helicopter watching off to the left, the B-24 coming, and then it goes in front of the helicopter stationary, and then it flies off past it, and it's on its way to France, over the water. And as it gets to just about where the helicopter is, who's stationary, a second airplane shows up, being piloted by one of the sons of Franklin Roosevelt. And I believe his job was to flick the switch to arm the airplane, the explosives, after he bailed out, and then flying it by remote control into the V1 site. But he flipped the switch to kill Joe Jr., and down he went. So the son is now killed. So now apparently the father never pieced it together. I presume he felt, he was a casualty of the World War, so he went to John. Said, John, I'll make you president. John was the accidental president. He was not supposed to win. This conspiracy that I've been documenting for 50 years promised Richard Nixon that election in 1960. So Nixon was supposed to win, but Joseph Jr., because of his mafia connections, bought the election results in Texas and in Illinois, and those two states were given to him by the mafia. They rigged those two states. So Kennedy won the election of 1960. People were screaming at Nixon, contest the vote, it's fraudulent. And Nixon said, no, I'm not going to do that, because he was promised the presidency, and then in 68. So that's the first. So now we got John president, and then John doesn't want to fight the war in Vietnam. Kennedy learned about the war. It was advisors first. Eisenhower sent military, like 20 or 30,000 troops over there to advise the South Vietnamese on how to fight the North Vietnamese. And finally, they were going to start a war, and Kennedy was asked to be the leader, the president, when that happened. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. He issued orders to withdraw the troops, the first 1,000, and promised, I've got that documented in my DVD, promised that after the election of 64, he would withdraw all the troops, and we ain't going to Vietnam. And that's not the plan. So Kennedy was taken out 4 days after those orders were issued. 4 days after the assassination, Johnson revoked the orders. Now, who did they do it? We've all heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were no missiles in Cuba. I can prove that. There were no missiles in Cuba. I can prove that. They had.
Okay, so let's prove that.
I'll try to do the best I can. I have seen pictures. We had a U-2 airplane, flew at something like 80,000 feet with a highly technical camera that could take pictures on the ground. And they took pictures after over and over. And the CIA brought some of those pictures in to show the Kennedy, the president, and his brother, Attorney General, and like 18 cabinet members and generals. Here are the pictures to show you they got missiles down there, missile bases, and none. 4 days, something like 6 days later, Kennedy says, I see missiles. There were missiles being brought. No, there were none. What we saw was tubes, covered tarps. Quonset huts where they housed these things. They called them garages. They kept their missiles inside a garage, and our cameras could not go through the Quonset hut, through the tent, or the tube, the garage. So we don't know what was in there. But anyway, the world believed that they had missiles. They brought them there, and Kennedy brought the United States to the brink of a nuclear war. Let me tell you how he did that. They advised him that they were going to, I don't know whether Kennedy believed at that point, maybe they did sneak him in, but he promised Khrushchev that we're going to inspect the ships that are there to withdraw them and take them back to Russia. We're going to make sure they were, and no ship was ever inspected. The Russians allegedly took out missiles. I've got pictures of 8 of those ships. Not one had anything on the deck but boxes or objects that looked like missiles covered by tarps. Not one missile, not one, nothing, never. So we never boarded any ship ever. But to summarize, we believed, the media believed, that Kennedy had brought us to the brink. Because if we had entered those ships in the ocean water, that's an act of war. And Russia could launch nuclear missiles on the United States, and Kennedy would be forced to launch ours, and we'd be at war over the fact. So they convinced rogue elements in the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, the Dallas Police Department, and there's one more, the Mafia, to become involved in planning an assassination of John Kennedy. Because he had brought, we can't wait. We can't wait for an election. That'd be a year or two. We might be at war with Russia. This was all done. This is why the Dallas Police Department was directly involved. They were willing to sacrifice the president because we had come to the brink of a nuclear war. We couldn't risk this lunatic with the nuclear weapons. He'd get us into a nuclear war and multiple millions of people would die. So they were willing to do this. Secret Service agents, the night before they were to take the trip along the route, they were drinking in body houses. And they were groggy the next morning. It was a wild party. The route was changed to make sure he went in front of the school book depository. When you study the routes those bullets took, the one that hit the man in the across the street on the other side of on Main could not have come from the school book depository. It would have been 16 feet over Kennedy's head and straight line. It had to come from the Dell Tex building, which is around the corner. There was no tree to fire through. So there was no one firing. If anyone was up there, he left cartridges and then got out. There was no one firing from that school book depository. I've got a DVD on it 2 hours long called The Kennedy Assassination. It covers about 75% of what I just covered. I found more than anyone else. There's one more group. Well, I won't get into the group. The group is identified in my DVD. You'll have to read about that one. There were 6 groups not directly, only people that were involved in positions that could help the assassination team kill him, make sure he's dead, that were directly involved, but not, of course, the whole group, the police department or the FBI, CIA, none.
Ralph, many say that Reagan gained office through the October surprise deal with the Iranians. What is it that we don't know about the Reagan era?
Oh boy, this is not going to sound very good. They're not going to like this. My conservative friends, my partners, but let's go back to 1963, 64 when I started. Because what I'm about to tell you is it's going to cast aspersions on Reagan being a conservative. So just wait, be open. If you're a Reaganite, please be open. I was a Reaganite, and I'll tell you how I knew and loved Reagan. I got involved in 1963 in the thing called the Young Republicans. And we were young people up to, they had age limits like 25 or 28, wherever it was, and after college or high school. So I joined them, and then I didn't know anything about that. I wanted to learn how to vote for governor and, Prop 101, etc. So I got involved, and they started convincing me that we got to elect Barry Goldwater in 64. And they were doing everything they could to give him the nomination. The delegate count in California was one of the last ones to be counted, and they felt that if California went for Goldwater in the primary, then other states where were hanging on the fire or other primaries would go for Goldwater, and he'd be the nominee. So I noticed the media and the television was just ripping Goldwater apart, just like they're doing with Donald Trump, calling him every conceivable thing. And then I noticed another guy running around the country saying the same thing, and it was Ronald Reagan. And I said, boy, I met Reagan a couple, just handshakes, and I spoke on a dais with him. I was a director on a convention or something of one of the groups I belonged to, and Reagan was down the line, and I stood up, and everybody applauded, and then Reagan got up, and of course he talked, but I shook his hand and thanked him and said, please, Governor, keep doing what you're doing, because you're really, et cetera. So anyway, I was really boosted, and so I said, we got to make this guy governor. He could be governor because he was, and there was no media attacking Reagan. Why? I kept saying, wait a minute, why? This guy's going to be governor and later become president. And then it started dawning on him. I learned later that both parties are controlled by the same people.
Sure are.
And I want you to know it was Bill Clinton that taught me that. Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, taught me that both parties are controlled by the same people. Oh, I don't believe that, Ralph. Okay, read his own book. You'll read it in his book, Putting People First. Page 231. He admitted that there was an international Anglophile network already controlling both parties equally. That means Reagan was controlled by the same people that were controlling who he was running against. So now let's finish this story. Reagan, there was a group called the United Republicans of California, and they were formed. There was a volunteer group called the California Republican Assembly in the statewide of California, and they were volunteers, but they got together to work, formulate plans and help the candidates run Republican Party. But they made no pre-primary endorsement. So the group of conservatives got together and created the UROC, United Republicans of California, and they made primary endorsements to put press releases out. Our party, our UROC group endorsed Barry Goldwater and so-and-so in town, and here's the resolution. And then we'd walk the precincts, and we elected Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan to governor. I can't remember, I think it was in maybe 66. But then I started wondering, wait a minute, why did Reagan not get attacked by the media? That doesn't make sense. If this guy's going to become a president, he's got the ability. He's got a lovely wife and no scandal. He made a movie about Bonzo, some chimpanzee, and people made fun of that. But that's not committing adultery or going out, sex parties or smoking dope or whatever. That's making a movie, making money. So anyway, this group, United Republicans, got behind Reagan and did walk the precincts, ran the headquarters, urged them, got the flyers out, got speeches for him. They worked arduously, difficultly up and down California to get him to become governor. And then they thought, boy, we got a governor in there, and they were making notes of all the promises he made. Boy, they were beautiful. Do this, and I'm going to, do this and abolish over here, and like Trump is doing. And boy, they made notes on all those things. But then after Reagan was elected twice, so it was 8 years, they started noticing very soon thereafter that he wasn't doing what he promised. He was doing the exact opposite. Well, wait a minute, Reagan, we got to talk to you. Please, let's meet and talk. Reagan will convince you. I'll do it, and then he didn't do it. So later on, they met in an annual convention, 14,000 members strong, and passed a unanimous resolution. If you want to read it, call me or write to me. I'll send you a copy. I've still got it. And they condemned him. This guy is a phony. He promises to do A and does Z. And they documented it in 5 pages. The article, I'll make it up, January the 5th, 1966, Reagan promises ABC, document, newspaper, and then what did he do? Supported a bill. And then in opposition. And he appointed so-and-so liberal and done all these things, and they footnote, document just a couple lines. There's like 100 of them. And so they condemned him unanimously. The people that elected him, who knew him, who believed in him, and then he ran for the president. And I did not vote for Reagan. I knew because I read the resolution. I left California, so I was not directly involved with what followed. I would have been. I was in the UROC group. I formed a local chapter and got the resolutions, got precinct workers, etc. So I did my job in my small town. So, but and I'll be honest with you, he did the same thing during his 8 years in office. I'll give you just one example. Reagan promised to abolish the Department of Education. Did he ever do that? It's still there? No. Did he ever give a balanced budget? He promised us that. Reagan raised the debt. Raised more the debt ceiling together, the national debt, more than all the presidents before. He promised a balanced budget, and a fiscal conservative never did it. Why? Because Clinton's right. Both parties are controlled by the same people. I can give you 2 more examples if you want us to take the time.
We absolutely have the time.
He ran against Walter Mondale. I think I'm a little sketchy on the year. I think it was his first term.
He ran against Walter Mondale in 1984.
Okay, thank you. Walter Mondale. Ralph Epperson coined a very important rule for any politician. If you're going to run for an office, never promise a tax increase. Why? People don't want to vote for taxes. They'll vote against you. Walter Mondale, his Democrat, the night of the nomination speech, with the largest audience that would watch him ever, no matter where he went to any city, even newspapers, and even the media coverage was never equal how many people watched him make a promise that he'd raise taxes. He knew the rule. Every politician knows this, except Mondale. He didn't make a mistake. They wanted Reagan. Who wanted Reagan? The very people that controlled both political parties. Do you understand, America? Reagan was a traitor, and I say that knowingly, convincingly. I used to believe this man. And once I started putting him together, everything came out lemons. I'm sorry. I've got the resolution. If you want to read it yourself, get back to me. Go to my website and call me or write to me. I'll send you a photocopy of it. You can read it yourself. 8 years of documentation of how he promised A and delivered Z. National debt-wise, we're still paying that thing. We always pay it off. They just keep increasing it. Oh, by the way, I got another example. Please forgive me. Well, it's in the 90s. I guess we can talk about that. Help me with this. Reagan was elected from 85 to 93. Is that correct?
No. Actually, Reagan was elected in 80, and he served from 81 to 89.
89, thank you. George Bush did the same thing, the father. Let's go back to the 2 years before the election, whenever that was. You can add and subtract. He violated rule number 1. Read my lips. No new taxes. 6 words. And then next year he raised taxes. Huh? What? George, why would you do that? Because the conspiracy wanted Bill Clinton in office. So Walter Mondale, a Democrat, through the election to Reagan, the Republican, and then George Bush, the father, a Republican, through the election to Clinton, the Democrat. Do you understand? That's the way these power people who run both parties play the game. You can watch this, and I've got a DVD called The Clinton's Conspiracy that documents this for you. You'll see the promises that these men made and what they did and how they did this. I date it and document, prove it. We're being conned. This stuff about 2 parties is madness. So now I'll make one more statement, and then we'll get to where you want to go. Little Ralphie, your dyed-in-the-wool historian, voted for Goldwater and never for either party until this last election. I refuse to vote for either Democrat or Republican presidential candidates because I believe they're both controlled by the same party. Now, I know it's just my vote, but you can't blame me because I didn't vote for either one of them. I refused to do it, and I never did. I voted for third party or wrote someone in.
I have also voted third party since 1996, Ralph, so I definitely understand the electoral struggle there, believe me. You know, one of the first conspiratorial works I read and loved was The Unseen Hand by one Ralph Epperson.
I'll be darned, thank you.
So one of the next works I found was this unique thing called Behold a Pale Horse.
Oh, yes.
Now, it's still very popular in the conspiratorial underground, Ralph, and especially since many now really do dismiss the work.
Yes.
I think part of its success, even its success now, stems from the idea that it feels like you're reading a private work that you're not supposed to read. And for someone who's just opening their mind to alternative theories, I can understand its appeal. So what did you think of Behold a Pale Horse and its author?
Well, this is probably the most difficult area to get into of all the ones you want to talk about. And I don't shirk my duties because I've got to do this. The book is still for sale. But I did not know Bill Cooper, but even though we both lived in Arizona, he lived up in the upper northwest northeast corner of the state, probably a 4 or 5 hour drive for me to go up there. But I knew about him, and I used to listen to his radio, his shortwave radio once in a while. But then I discovered that I had difficulty getting the signal because of mountains between us, and the signal apparently came from, I guess, Las Vegas. I don't know. I couldn't listen, so I didn't listen. So anyway, I put together a seminar on the Kennedy assassination in Phoenix, and there was a group of conservatives up there. Probably they met on Saturday mornings, about 100 of them, and I spoke up there probably twice a year at their request. I drove from Tucson, and so one day I'm up there, and Harry, the guy that was president, was a good friend. He became a good friend of mine. He liked me and liked what I was doing, so he said, "Come sit on the dais up in the front." And so there were 6 of us. I'll start on the left-hand side. There was the pastor, then me, and then the president, then the podium, and then another guy, I don't know who it was, and then Bill Cooper, and then the 6th guy. There were 6 of us. So apparently Cooper looked down and he recognized everybody except me. And someone said, "That's Ralph Epperson." And he said, "Ralph Epperson, you're kidding me. I can't believe this guy. He's great." So they introduced Cooper first. He stood up and said, "I am honored to be in the same room with Ralph Epperson." And I said, "Well, I don't even know you, Cooper." I don't know if I read his book or not. But anyway, I said, so they praised me for 5 minutes about my 2 books. I guess probably both of my 2 books were out, because he quotes them both in his book. But anyway, so this must have been after he written the Behold a Pale Horse. So then we shook hands, and then years later he called me and invited me to come to Eager, Arizona, to do 5 broadcasts with him over 3 days, 2, 2, and 1. And I did. I drove up there. We taped them, and then he played them, and I guess sequence or whatever it was. And I think sold them as a package, and I'm grateful he did. But then I read the book, and I'll be honest with you, I'm very disappointed. And there are several things that bothered me. I want you to. It's always difficult to talk about people that are in the same field, because I would give him about a B- if I was giving him a grade, because the things that didn't give him an A are very disturbing to me. He made a comment that the aliens videotaped the crucifixion of Jesus. Huh? Where's that in the book? I read it. It's still there. Wait a minute. Where's the tape? And secondly, how come you knew about it but don't have a copy of the tape? Bill, I hate to say this, but he's the one that kept saying, "Don't believe me, document everything I say." Well, he didn't document that. As far as I know, there's never been any evidence that anyone videotaped the crucifixion of Jesus. So that bothered me. Same thing about the missile, the UFOs he saw. He said he was on board a ship and saw the ship, the thing come out of the water and then float around, then come back and hit the water, and then disappeared. It happened a couple times, and no one else saw it. But then later on, either the book or the tape, he said that there were a couple others that saw it as well, and they took pictures. Well, where are the pictures? They didn't show up either. So I don't understand. I do not believe in UFOs, and it's not a matter. I've never seen one, but I always say this: I'll believe in UFOs when one lands and I can kick the tires. In other words, show me. I'm an honorary citizen of Missouri, the show me state. And if you're not an honorary citizen of Missouri, you should be one. Like me, I'm an honorary. I name myself that. I say to Bill Cooper, "You got UFOs, show me." He didn't. "You got a UFO, you got a picture of Jesus being crucified, show me." And other things that he did. That book is, about a third of it is wasted effort. He documents whole reports, and no one reads them. I don't understand. And secondly, there's no, if I remember, I guess he does have footnotes, but I don't know. Anyway, that's enough.
Well, like I said before, Ralph, I think it appeals to someone who's really new into conspiratorial research, because I think it does feel like you're sort of reading a top secret file that you're not supposed to have.
Yeah.
So for someone who's new, I think that's really the appeal, and still today, I think that's currently the appeal.
Yeah, I guess that there's some merit to that. I understand that. No, as I say, I'd give it a B-. By the way, I want to tell you, if I may, if I don't blow my own horn, very few people will for me. But and this sounds the way. But I want you to know this is really, I think, very indicative of the kind of comments I get on the Unseen Hand. And this is a story eyeball that happened to me personally. So it's an eyeball, me and one other fellow. And it won't take but a couple of minutes. But I was doing a gun show up in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was a Saturday, Sunday thing, and I think they closed down at 4 o'clock, and this must have been 3 o'clock, and already people had shut their booth down because there weren't very many people. But I said, there's still people walking out, and I'm going to give them one more chance to look at my table and my books. So I'm standing there, very few people going by, but I'm going to wait till 4 o'clock. So this guy walked by, a young man, I would guess in his late 20s, dressed like, carrying a backpack, and he walked by, didn't say a word, and I don't push it. I let them see it and then come to me. I don't say, hey, listen, you got to read this book or blow my horn. So he walked by, he saw the book cover, and it dawned on him maybe a couple of feet away, wait a minute, I've read that book. So he turned around maybe 10 feet away and said, did you write that book? And I said, oh boy, here it comes. He's going to rip me apart. I said, yes, I did, sir. He said, why? He said, listen, then he turned and started walking towards me, and as he's walking, this is what he said. He said, I want you to know that I'm half a semester away from getting my master's degree at Arizona State University, which is in a suburb of Phoenix. So that's nearly 18 years of schooling, 18 years, and he said, my master's thesis is on political science, and he named the subject, didn't matter. He said, I want you to know something, I read your book. And he said, I learned more about my field, political science, in your book than I've learned in nearly 18 years of my education.
Wow, that's great.
And I'm telling you, you want to talk about somebody becoming jello. Can you believe that?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's what he said. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I'm not joking. He said, I'm going on for my PhD. And I'm going to talk about your book. I said, lots of luck. You're not going to like that. Then he walked on by.
Well, if you're ready, let me tell you a little story, Ralph. So I'm in college around 1993, and I'm a jacket and tie young Republican kid, and this is a story that I'll tell in more detail on a future episode, but needless to say, I, like you, was a young Republican and really into the party.
Oh boy, that's rare.
And then one day in April of 93, I sat in my dorm room and I watched the federal government go into a home, not a compound. That's a word used by the media. They went into a home in Waco, Texas, with a tank, killed over 80 people, including 18 children. Then the next year, I watched Oklahoma.
Yes.
Now, Ruby Ridge had also happened in this time, and I was just forever changed by these events. But approximately 6 months to a year later, I'm in the library, and I find a little book called, well, it's actually not that little, to be honest with you. I find a book with a black cover and gold writing called The Unseen Hand by A. Ralph Epperson.
Oh boy.
And it was the first time that I had read sort of a conspiratorial history of America and,
oh my goodness,
to a great extent, the world. Now, I had read some JFK stuff, but The Unseen Hand was really important to me and to my life and to my views now and to the path that I've taken since the Young Republican days. After Waco, I never attended a Young Republican meeting again, and I've voted third party ever since. So that's my story, Ralph.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing that. That's very kind of you, and I'm really appreciative of what you just said. That really helps.
Now, the 1990s, which were the Clinton years, was a really confusing time regarding the use of power. Now, we had Waco, as I said, we had Ruby Ridge, we had Oklahoma City, and all of this leads to 2001 and 9/11.
Yes.
What do we know about these events and how they've led us to where we are today?
Yes. I'm not sure I can answer that question, because I still have questions about that whole thing. There's no question that young man did not blow that building up. There's some general named Parton or somebody. He was this country's leading explosives expert, and he studied that thing and said there were explosives in the back part of the building that were supposed to go off. He found 3 of them, and only one of them went off. And so that bomb and whatever it was called, and that truck couldn't do the damage. So that means that building was meant to be brought down. And notice one more thing: there was a little kindergarten, I think, in there. So 30. Forgive me. I don't know how many of those children died that day, but some of those children did die, and that's to gain sympathy that we got to really get the guys that did that. But I cannot tell you why, what happened. It doesn't make sense to me.
Now, you've researched so much for so many years. I'm really interested in getting your perspective on the election of 2016.
Let me give you the best I can come up with, and I'm being very honest with you. As I think I told you, I voted always third party from 64. I voted 64, but from that point on, never voted for a Republican or Democrat. And I started watching the 2 candidates for this thing. And of course, I couldn't vote. I knew Hillary was a disaster, and I knew because of her husband and what he did, I couldn't vote for her or him or either one. So I started listening to Trump, and I said, I'm going to forget that he's Republican. And he started making sense. He was saying the right things that no one else would ever say. And I said, wait a minute, if this guy's legitimate, this guy can save this country. It all depends on how much he knows. So I listened to him as much as I could, and I've got a business to run. So I listened to him and watched him on television, and I decided that I was going to vote for him, not as a Republican, but him himself, and take my chances. If he wins and is not legitimate, there's no way for me to know that until he decides, to educate us that he's not legitimate. But if he's legitimate, I wanted to be on his side. So I voted for Trump. I refused to vote for him because the party asked me to. I'm a registered Republican because I vote for locally for conservatives to run for office. I do my share, and I give my vote when I find them. So I registered Republican, but I've never voted for Republican in 50 years. But I voted for Trump, but not as a Republican. He could have run as an independent. He'd get my vote. Now, here's the clue. We don't know which side he's on until, we won't know until. I watched the guy, Gorsuch, whatever his name was, the nominee for Supreme Court. I watched him testify before that committee, probably a total of maybe a couple hours. And I kept admiring what he was saying. And I said, wait a minute, this guy is a true doctrinaire. If it says vote yes on Thursday, I vote on yes on Thursday. So he kept saying that over and over. I said, well, that's what we need. So then he got him in. So I said, but notice this, the Supreme Court has always been, or at least recently, a 5-4 majority. And this is the Hegelian dialectic. Maybe you know what that means. For your listeners who've never heard it, let me explain this, and you'll start to see it happen all the time. The liberals come up with what they call the thesis. We want A to be passed, or this guy to be passed, and then the antithesis or antithesis, I like antithesis, comes out and says, no, we don't want it passed, and we'll tell you why. And then out of that struggle comes what they call the synthesis. Now, if you want the synthesis, you gotta control both sides. You understand? So in other words, the guy said, we want to vote yes, and the other guy says, we're going to vote no. If you want a yes vote, you make sure the no guys don't win. And that's what we're doing. They want the debate. So we say, oh yeah, it's a democracy, and they rule, and as we lost, but we came close. We got 4 votes in the Supreme Court, and we only need, so it's always been 5-4. Scalia, I believe, was one of the 4. And I'm partially convinced he was murdered. I can't explain what happened to him, but it doesn't matter. He's gone. So they now got a 5-3 vote. So now they said Trump can nominate a conservative, which is what you'd expect him to do, and he did it. So now it's back to 5-4. So the next one is the key, because if it's a liberal, and some of those people are in their 80s, and the liberals, 4 or 5, or 3 or 4, where it is, one of them is rumored to come out in August or September, and he's a liberal, so if he resigns, who Trump fills that job with is the key to telling us which side he's on. If he appoints another liberal, the game is over. Either he's ignorant and legitimate, but does, pull the game. They told him to vote for, support this guy, and he did it. That's not good for us. So the key is the next step. So far, I'd give him a B- as well. I don't like many of the things he does with his mouth and his tweeting, but the guy has done some phenomenal things and achieved victories and taken positions that I have to support as a conservative, a true conservative. So I'm just saying, watch who he appoints. If a liberal comes out, if another conservative comes out, he'll appoint another conservative. But it's always going to be 5-4. If he's legitimate, it'll be 5-4 in our favor. Because the people are already warning that if he gets another younger one like this guy, who's in his 40s or 50s, he could control the Supreme Court for, maybe 30 years.
Now, if you want to read Ralph Epperson, read The Unseen Hand, read The New World Order. In fact, just go ahead and read all his works. And go ahead while you're at it and watch a few of his videos as well. But they need to know, Ralph. They need to know where to get the books. They need to know where to get the videos. So please let them know.
All of those details are provided at my website. My phone number. I'm in the phone book. I'm really Ralph Epperson. That's not with a pen name. It's been since my birth. I don't have a birth certificate, but I got some sort of document. It's listed as Ralph Epperson. So that's really me. So you can find me in the phone book or even do a Google search. Go to my website. If you type in, of course, www, then .Ralph, R-A-L-P as in Petunia, H, Ralph, R-A-L-P-H, and then there's a dash, and then the last name is Epperson, E as in Edward, P as in Peter, ERSON.com, Ralph-Epperson.com. All of my phone numbers there. It's my home business. I'm single. I live by myself, no children to bother, so I answer the phone. I live by myself. I'm free to come and go as I like. I'm here probably 90% of the time. If I'm gone, it's only for a little while. I'll come back and, call me and leave a message. So, and I take phone calls from people who got questions or comments. If you're on Facebook, I'm Ralph Epperson there. Make me a friend. I'll approve it. And then we can chat through messages. And I'm on Skype. AZ Writer, AZ as in zebra, right for Arizona, then WRITER. You'll find that on there. Call me, write to me on Skype, and let's talk. Call me if you want. I take phone calls whenever they call, as long as they're legitimate.
He's one of the guys who paved the way. He's Ralph Epperson, author of The Unseen Hand and The New World Order. Ralph, it's been an honor. Thank you very much for being on the show tonight.
Well, I can only thank you, ST, for your very kind offer. I'll be happy to do that. And any of your listeners that are listening right now want to get in touch, it's 9:30. I'll be up for another hour and a half or so. So please call me even tonight, and we'll talk. At any time, I'll do what I can to assist. Thanks so very much for your very kind attention.
This has been Ralph Epperson. I'm ST Patrick on the Midnight Rider News Show. We'll be right back. If you are still with us tonight, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you. I've said it on multiple episodes, and you'll hear it over and over again throughout the show. I believe it's important to pay homage to those researchers and authors who paved the way so that the new generation of online document hounds and amateur photography experts can do what we do. Listening to the researchers I mentioned earlier, John Lear, William Cooper, May Brussel, Gary Allen, and yes, Ralph Epperson, is a different experience than listening to one of the new generation of researchers. As they have aged, they've become storytellers who have spent decades weaving the cacophony of links together until it's a tightly rolled ball of yarn. But consider for a moment what they've done. Being alternative is now an industry with hundreds, if not thousands, of strands that have emanated from one: conspiracy. These researchers, along with ones I failed to mention earlier, Eustace Mullins, Manly Pial, Lawrence Gardner, Tex Mars, and Al Cuppet, who we interviewed in episode 2, these researchers were alone in their research. There were no journals, there were no conferences, no online document depositories. They had to want to do the research for more than the possibility of transitioning it into a career. They had to decide to be all in because they cared. The older community of researchers tell tales of lost finances, lost time, and lost relationships. They sacrificed to do what they did. They spent much of their incomes on long-distance telephone calls, Xeroxed copies of files and research, and postage, not to mention the miles and miles of highways and byways that each researcher saw as they drove days just to meet with one person for one file, or to do one interview. When we're able to make contact with one of these researchers, we're going to give them time and a forum to tell us what they've done, what they believe, and what they're currently selling in an attempt to recoup their years of costs. We will not turn them down, and we will not write them off in favor of someone who solely creates 4-minute YouTube videos. There's a room for all ideas, all mediums, and all generations. So tonight, I want to say thank you to Ralph Epperson. Thank you to Ralph's colleagues in arms, and thank you to those who continue to download these episodes of our show. To all of you, thank you for paving the paths of truth, one stone at a time. We begin as a road, and we shall end as a highway. In the words of Bruce Springsteen, the highway is alive tonight. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com, and be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.